afternoon, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have everyone with us today. To be here for this webinar, where we're so grateful to have Dr. Jim Fadiman with us, speaking of microdosing. Before we get into today's session with Jim, I'm just going to give a brief introduction to Mind Medicine Australia. For many of you, you will know this, but for all of those who are new on the session, just to give a brief overview of our organisation and the work that we do, and then I'll happily pass the mic over and introduce Jim. Just to begin with a quick disclaimer, Mind Medicine Australia's focus is on the development and use of evidence-based psychedelic-assisted therapies within the regulated healthcare system. We don't encourage the use of psychedelic medicines outside of its context, and we don't support the use of these substances in any way that's unlawful. Our presentations are intended for educational purposes only. They don't constitute medical advice. Individuals should discuss their individual health needs with a healthcare provider, and just so everyone's aware, these sessions, we will record it, and it'll be shared on our YouTube channel. And so, to give a brief overview of the state of the healthcare system in Australia, as everyone on this call will be aware, we are really struggling. We're facing some challenges in mental health. One in 4, 1 in 5 Australians have a mental illness. It's up to 1 in 6 that are on antidepressants, and this is a significant increase in recent years, including 1 in 30 in children, 1 in 4 in older people. This leads to massive costs, and this includes costs to society, but more important than financial costs is really the costs to people's life and suffering that's caused from it. And what we've seen over the last number of years that Mind Medicine Australia has been around is that in terms of decisions from governments and peak bodies, it's a slow process of slow and incremental change. And so what we see with this is that despite a lot of great efforts from clinicians, this mental health problem we're not seeing significant improvement. And so the elephant in the room, as we like to say, is a lack of innovation in treatment for mental illness. And so what do I mean by that? What we mean to say is that there's been very little meaningful improvement in treatment outcomes for 50 years or more. Since antidepressants came on the scene back in the 70s, there haven't been any major new developments in medical treatments for mental illness. With depression, we see low remission rates from pharmacotherapy can be as low. We see 40 to 60% showing response, but many experiencing continuing symptoms with high relapse rates and a lot of side effects, such as insomnia, psychosis, blurred vision, and PTSD. Again, we can see remission rates as low as 5%. And so a more of the same approach really isn't what we need to solve this significant problem. And so to introduce Mind Medicine Australia, we are a charity and a not-for-profit focused on alleviating suffering through new treatment innovation. And we're really looking at this from a whole system approach. Our primary focus is on psychedelic-assisted therapies and integrating these into our healthcare system in a controlled way. So as you can see here, there's 3 primary medicines that we have a focus on, perhaps 2 primarily, which is psilocybin and MDMA, and then also ketamine as a third medicine, which is not always considered a psychedelic, but at certain doses and when used in certain ways does have psychedelic effects. And our indications of success are if we can see these therapies becoming integrated into our mental health system, achieving high remission rates, leading to substantial improvement of the mental health statistics I mentioned earlier, and also, and very importantly, for these to become accessible and affordable to all Australians who could benefit from them. And so, just to expand a little bit more on these medicines and on these treatments, our primary focus, as I mentioned, is on psilocybin and MDMA. At this stage, psilocybin has more data for depression, but there's also earlier promising outcomes in studies looking at other indications such as OCD and addiction, and MDMA, which currently is most progressed in its research for PTSD, but also potentially for addiction and depression with other indications that have earlier phase data. In these protocols, these are using higher doses, so a little bit different to what we're talking about today, but with 2 to 3 dosing sessions, as opposed to ongoing treatment. And the treatments are aiming to have a substantial improvement. So one could say, and some have said, they're curative, sorry, rather than palliative. The data, they have great safety data when used in these controlled environments, and we haven't seen any signs of addiction. So just briefly to give an overview of how we go about promoting these and working towards these goals at My Medicine Australia, we have 4 strategic areas. These are awareness and knowledge building. This is with sessions such as today. We have a professional development program where we focus on training healthcare professionals to understanding how to deliver these treatments. We support research. So that's in the research sector, trying to develop the knowledge base of these therapies, and then also supporting patient access. And we have a number of different programs in that area. And just to give a very brief highlight of some of the achievements we've had across those 4 areas in the last 6 years since we started. Looking at patient access, and perhaps one of the most significant achievements has been the successful rescheduling of MDMA and psilocybin in Australia. This made Australia the first country in the world to move these from being classified as a banned substance with no recognized value to it now a controlled medicine. So Australia being the first country in the world to recognize these as medicines. In addition to that, we secured access pathways for MDMA and psilocybin. So this is to allow for equitable access to high quality medicines of MDMA and psilocybin in Australia. And then we also have a patient support fund. And this is a fund that subsidizes treatment for those who are seeking treatment with MDMA or psilocybin in Australia, who otherwise couldn't afford it. So obviously there's a time gap before different funders are able to start providing funding subsidies and government funding and things like that for any new treatment. And this is an initiative that we have to allow for private citizens, such as everyone on this call, to help support those in need to access these treatments in these early stages. In awareness and knowledge building, we hosted an international summit on psychedelic-assisted therapies. This was back in 2021, actually. It was the first from the Southern Hemisphere of its kind. We run this global webinar series, as well as many other awareness building events. Our professional development program is centered around our certificate in psychedelic-assisted therapies, which is a 4-month training program, and we'll be reaching almost 500 psychiatrists and other clinicians from a broad range of healthcare professionals trained through that program at the end of this year. And we also have our introductory training program, which is a 6-week online program called the Fundamentals of Psychedelic-Assisted Therapy, which is actually running a cohort currently at the moment. And we're doing that at the moment in collaboration with Drug Science based in the UK. And then in research, our advocacy secured, there was a $15 million Commonwealth government grant, which was then issued to 7 different studies from different institutions around Australia. It was the largest government grant of its kind at the time for psychedelic research in the world. And we're also Australia's largest funder of research outside of government and pharmaceutical sectors. And perhaps as one key initiative there is a registry that we've helped to fund at the Australian National University. And this is collecting outcome data from the clinical use of psychedelics in this new regulatory program as a way to collect outcome data so we can see how these treatments work out in real clinical practice now that Australia is a leading country with allowing clinical access outside of trials. And so, as I mentioned, this is just one to highlight this really key thing that happened in Australia last year, this key change with Australia being the first country in the world to reschedule MDMA and psilocybin. We have clinical access more so than almost any other country in the world. While it is still heavily restricted and there are still, it's only for specific indications, it does mean that there's some real opportunities in Australia, but also, as it says here, an obligation on us to get it right and to deliver these therapies in a way that's done safely and effectively, and also to collect data and keep understanding them so that we can work out how best to progress the use of these medicines. So as a couple of final points from me before I pass over to Jim, This is a couple more points about our certificate in psychedelic assisted therapies. If there are any healthcare professionals on this call who are interested in this space, this training really is the best opportunity that you'll have to upskill and move into it. It runs over 4 months. 4 months, the majority is online, and then there's an in-person 6-day training. We're about to actually start that next week for the current group, and it is open to a wide range of professionals who are interested in the field. We have an incredible faculty. We're incredibly lucky to be working with such amazing people. Jim is included on this faculty as well, and we're incredibly grateful to him for this. And so our next intake is beginning in February, and applications are just open until the end of November. So you've got about 6 weeks left. So for anyone who is interested in training, please do go to cpat.mindmedicineaustralia.org. You can apply, and you can also make contact with our team for more information if you have any questions. So please do reach out and learn more. The fundamentals program that I mentioned earlier, if you go to mindmedicineaustralia.org.au/fundamentals, you can learn more about this. This is open to anybody, even if you're an interested member of the general public, for a fundamental understanding of how these therapies work over 6 weeks online. Please do go there, and you can enroll, and you are actually even able to join the current live group that's running and catch up on the first 2 weeks. Week 3 is live this Sunday. And then finally, if you would like to help in any other ways, you can help us with fundraising and volunteering. You can go to mindmedicineaustralia.org. As I mentioned, apply for CPAT. And in particular, the patient support fund that I mentioned earlier, if you are of means and would like to support someone to receive access to these treatments who otherwise couldn't, any donations made into that fund, 100% of that will go to subsidizing treatment. And so it's an amazing way to support somebody in need to make a really, really meaningful impact in somebody's life. And so apologies, here's a slide for that one there. You can go to mindmedicineaustralia.org.au/PSF if you'd like to make a donation into that fund. And so with that, sorry, I have one last slide. Apologies, I've got everything out of order, but just as a final piece, upcoming events, we do have 2 more of these webinars between now and the end of the year. One with Professor Robin Carhart-Harris and then Professor Alan Young. And then our program for next year is opening up, and will continue to be populated over the next few weeks and months with Bill Richards and Heather Lee. And so please do go to mindmedicineaustralia.org/events to sign up for those, to keep learning from some of the world's best. And so that is actually finally it from me. I will stop sharing my screen. And now it brings me great pleasure to introduce Jim. Dr. Jim Fadiman, I am guessing for the vast majority of the people on this call, needs no introduction. I'll give a short one anyway. He has been a seminal figure in this space since he was doing research in the 60s into LSD before the psychedelic winter started, and then he also during that time he was a leading figure in the transpersonal psychology space, and then has been an important figure since things started up again. As I've mentioned, I think when I last did one of these sessions with Jim, his book, The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, was extremely influential for me. So it's always an incredible pleasure to do these sessions with him. And Jim, thank you so much for being with us. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. And thank you so much to be speaking about microdosing.
Well, thank you very much. It's very good to be here. Some decades ago, I told my family that the way the United States was going, that we should look into Tasmania, and we did, and we almost moved. Given the United States now, I think I will have to get my connections in Tasmania renewed in case we need to leave the country fast. But so far, so good. And after listening to that really wonderful description of what a group of people who want to do the right thing and have really no other agenda can end up doing. and it is a pleasure to be part of the information dissemination part to the leading country in the world in psychedelic assisted therapy. Now, most of you have some very vague idea of what microdosing is, and we will go to that in some detail. I should warn you, some detail is really quite a lot of detail, because I've spent the last 12 years exploring the microdosing space, and there will be a very comprehensive book out in January covering all that. So you're going to be the first group that gets to know a little bit of what the span of microdosing is, and it's considerably larger, more varied, and perhaps have a very different value than the psychedelic therapy and the psychedelic assisted therapy that that you all have just been talked about. And I feel kind of doubly honored. One is it's great to be here, and two is, given that I'm coming up with a lot of alternatives and a much different way of approaching everything, only a very secure organization would have invited me. So with that, we're going to look at, and the title, which I probably made 6 months ago, is obviously grandiose, and we won't do all that. But I will give you a lot of what you need to know about microdosing. And even if I were giving the title today, I would be forced to say everything you need to know about modern psychedelic microdosing. The word microdosing has escaped from its comfortable psychedelic kind of space. And my co-author of the book, Jordan Gruber, just sent me something showing a male bodybuilder talking about a particular substance, which he says, if you take it in microdoses, it's really great. And I looked up what it was, and it's something terrible. It's something with so many awful side effects that it's hard to believe anybody would ever take it, except bodybuilders who really, in a curious way, are willing to destroy their bodies so their bodies look like they're really healthy. But the word microdosing I've seen now with coffee. The one that puzzled me was microdosing marriage, and I didn't follow up on that. So, but here we are. And I want us to start with what we would call the beginnings of actual science. And actual science was started in 1660, the Royal Academy in London, which was to move away from theological assumptions about reality which had no evidence. And their motto was nothing on authority, nothing. And that only direct evidence generated by experiments and first person's observations reveal scientific truth. And what we've seen in the microdosing space is that first person observation precedes almost every scientific study. Meaning people don't just say, well, we're going to do a scientific study on something. What would we like to do it on? The answer is usually, you know, I read something, or I had a friend, or something happened, or this made sense, or somebody in South America wrote me and talked about, let's look into it. And so we're going to look into it. And I think the questions that you actually have, some of you may have scientific questions, and I recommend almost every other speaker in this series, which is the questions that many of you have is, what is it? What's it good for? Will it help me? Or will it help someone I know? And is it safe? Psychedelics are among the safest kind of psychochemicals that exist. Microdoses being 100th to 1,000th of the dose of those same super safe psychochemicals are even safer. We used to be able to say there has never been a death from, for example, LSD. Recently, we got our first. Somebody took a overdose, not a double, not a triple, not 50 times, 14,000 times a reasonable dose. You can do that with LSD because you're using millions of a gram. He didn't do well. However, we do have some cases of people who only took 500 times as much as a full therapeutic dose and did actually, after a couple of days of not waking up, extremely well and actually had improvements in underlying mental conditions. So we're dealing with very safe substances. The other way we check on safety is how many thousands of years have people been using it? The assumption is that if something would be bad for you, people after a couple of thousand years would have figured that out. So the fact that psychedelics have been used, microdoses and up for thousands of years suggests safety. So let's put safety aside and get into what is it? What is a microdose? Okay, a microdose is a small amount of a classic psychedelic, predominantly psilocybin and LSD. If you ask 10,000 people and we have what are you microdosing with, 95 to 98% will say LSD or psilocybin. A few will have a number of other things, some of which none of us have ever heard of, some of which make reasonable sense, but they're talking again about very small doses. All of the that I'll be talking to you about is predominantly psilocybin because it's first-person observations from at least 50 countries. And the fact that, because mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms, grow on every continent but Antarctica. And there are at least 200 species. So, and by the way, none of these mushrooms have ever been told or understood that they're illegal. So they continue to sprout. And the psilocybin mushrooms, for some reason, grow better near human beings who disturb the soil, who do construction, who put in backyard gardens, who do it in lawns. So psilocybin happens perhaps to like us. We don't know. But we have certainly decided we like them. So that's a microdose, a very small amount. If you want to be a little more technical, it's a 10th to a 20th of what some of you understand is a recreational dose. That's still way below therapeutic. But it's a very, very, very little bit. Microdoses are single events. Microdosing, which is what I will be telling you about, is taking microdoses over a period of several weeks to several months in a particular schedule, and then including always days off between taking, weeks or months off between kind of major rounds of 4 to 6 weeks. So we're talking about something which is taken very small, not too often, and with time off. And the reason for that scheduling is partly chance and some of my early work where I designed what's called a protocol, which is really just a classy word for schedule, so I could get more information. But it turns out that it works more successfully for the conditions we'll be looking at with this kind of schedule. And according to the people who are even against the use of microdoses, one of the major people who starts terrible rumors of how bad it can be said in a note to me, actually, the way you all have scheduled it, even I think it's safe. So we're okay. And it may be that the reason it works so well is that the time off gives your body the chance to figure out how to make use of the advantages that happen when you've added microdosing. So we may be we're talking about cumulative improvements in a number of conditions. So what's it good for? Okay, a lot. And I mean that, as you'll see. But what we can say is the reason it improves a number of things is it improves overall functioning. We are an amazingly complicated set of systems with a much more complicated brain than we have any understanding of. But what we do know is that there are things that you can do that enhance the whole system, that makes everything work better. And it looks like microdoses are more akin to those things than to a tightly focused pharmaceutical, which attacks a single symptom of a single condition. So we're going to look at enhanced wellness and improved abilities. That's for normals. That's us, or we hope most of us. We'll look at some of the most common illnesses worldwide and how microdosing might be helpful. And where contemporary medicine, as you got that description of what happens with depression and PTSD, current medications simply aren't very good. They're way better than nothing, but they're not very good. They're a start, and microdosing may be, as high-dose psychedelics have proved to be, an improvement. And then we'll also look at a whole lot of mental and physical, what we call medical conditions, things that have a label and a specialty in medical schools, and even their own professional organizations. That's one of the ways modern medicine defines itself is, do you have your own journal? Okay, so we'll look at that. So let's look at creative enhancement for the first. Remember, this is just us. This is everyone. You don't have to be ill in order to be more well. Now, I don't know enough about the Australian medical system. I like a lot of it, but in the American medical system, there is no category for wellness. The only way you get into the medical system is to have an illness that can be controlled. Wellness is something else. And what we've found in microdosing is better problem solving. Tim Ferriss, very interesting human being with wide international exposure, said once that all the billionaires he knows in Silicon Valley have used LSD. Now, what he was saying is that they had a common experience of using psychedelics, which benefited them for creativity and mental acuity. People use microdosing simply to get to work better, more successfully, and with more pleasure. I have a couple of fascinating reports from people that said, my job is really crappy, but when I microdose, it doesn't bother me as much. Now, you can say, oh, that's terrible. They should feel really bad, so they'll do something else. No, they still want to do something else. They're perfectly aware that the job is thankless or pointless or too busy or too hard, but they're aware that they can not get caught up in their own negativity. And that's a remarkable feat for the mind to do. Now, very popular is using microdoses in school for the obvious reasons. People who microdose report again and again and again, my grades went up. I used to get B's, and now I'm getting A's. And there's a young man in an Ivy League, very, very high class university, who said he was really struggling in math, and he was a math major. And he microdosed, and then he said, I picked the hardest math course in the catalog, and I did it well, and I did it without anxiety. That's the kind of thing we're looking at. Now, this is high functioning, really smart, together person with a hard major, but he finds that somehow microdosing improved whatever he was doing. Okay, so better grades is very usual and certainly beneficial. Better sex. Now, better sex is, we're not sure what's going on. There are two possibilities. One is more libido, more simply sexual energy. The other possibility is better communication, more ease, more closeness, more awareness of each other's presence and physical and emotional needs, so that the relationship is improved and the sex improves. Any of you out there who want to do research, just let me know what you learn. We're still learning. Better in sports, faster, stronger, more aware of the other. This is particularly clear. We have a wonderful guy in martial arts and jujitsu. And what he says is, before microdosing, I was getting silver medals. Now I get golds. Now, I have actually talked to him because he's getting a PhD in things, and we have other things in common. And he's got a whole lot of his martial arts friends also microdosing, and they also basically say it improves what they already have learned, what they know how to do. And again, what we get reports is, I'm more aware of the other. It's not just about more self and more grandiosity and being, it's about paying more attention to what is going on in front of you. So, vision improvement, by the way, we have a few cases of people who literally, when they microdose, the one that I liked is, when I microdose, I notice I just don't need my reading glasses for another 10 days. So there's something going on, okay? Now, I'm going to summarize all of that by what we call real world evidence. Real world evidence is, how does it work? Not in the lab, not in academics, not in the hospital, but in your home, in your body. So this is a report that came onto Reddit some years ago. And I had sent it to a friend of mine who wrote a book called A Really Good Day, How Microdosing Mega Changed My Mood, My Marriage, and My Life. Friend of mine. And I looked at this and I thought, wow, this is what a really good day might look like. And I just came across it and thought, it summarizes what I'm doing so much better than I do. This is the first day after my first 1/10 of a gram dose of psilocybin. The differences for now are subtle, but they're there. I had my first therapy session in a while, and for once I did most of the talking. She seemed a little surprised by this and mentioned one thing I never even shared before. I had an issue with work, misunderstanding with my boss, and I managed to send emails and communications with him and my other boss, and I didn't feel like a total idiot sending them either. I usually have crippling anxiety that makes me not even want to be around other people, but it made me look forward to going into the office. I feel confident about my work. I design web pages, and I showed my boss, and she seemed amazed by what I'd made. Food today seemed more enjoyable than it has in weeks. I didn't feel like I was just eating to eat. I enjoyed the way it felt, chewing and swallowing. I watched a movie I absolutely love, and I teared up at this one part I've never reacted to. It made me really pause and relate to the character. I feel like I'm just seeing a different part of things I never even thought about before. I just feel happier for a change, not numb. That's the range of normal. Now, remember, that's not psychedelic assisted therapy. That's not a medical condition. That's not a chronic, terrible thing that is destroying your life. This is just moderately effective, somewhat neurotic person who found microdosing affected so many areas. She's such a good observer of herself. So I could have just put that out in front, but I talked you through it instead. So let's put healthy people aside, and let's look at a couple of areas where we have the most reports and the most cases and the most hard-nosed research, as well as all the observational data that we work with. Depression. Okay. Now, I should warn you that the definition of depression is being depressed. The medical measurements for depression, this is the most common mental illness in humanity. No physical tests, no blood tests, no brainwave tests, nothing defines someone who's depressed. Questionnaires. How do you feel this? Do you feel about that? And how about this? And there's 6 or 7 terrific instruments. of questions. The only one item they have in common, all the 7 best ones, is, are you sad? So if you want to know if someone is depressed, I'll save you a year or 2 of clinical work. You say, are you depressed? And that's the answer. Now, you can also say, are you a little depressed? Somewhat depressed? Depressed? Very depressed? Incredibly depressed? Suicidally depressed? Those are scales also. But the major thing, and unfortunately most of us have had experience with it, is depression feels like depression. And how you can tell, by the way, this is not in the medical textbooks, is when bad things happen, you should feel bad. That's correct. That's an appropriate behavior, unless you're, a very clarified Buddhist. But for most of us, if things go wrong, we feel bad. Now, depression is when things don't go bad, and you still feel the same way, where good things do not affect you in a good way. So what we know is, and you got it in the introduction, is antidepressants don't work very well, and even the manufacturers acknowledge about 30% of people get no benefit at all. The problem is that the benefits, which are genuine, are predominantly that you are less likely to be made upset or sad or miserable when bad things happen, so that you can handle bad things better. The drawback, and why people often hate their antidepressants, is that you don't feel good things much easier. The term that is used in the depression world is, I feel like a zombie. Okay, so what happens when you take microdoses? 2 things. One is the same as in antidepressants, bad things don't feel so bad. The difference is good things feel better. So you are less sad and more glad. And that's a huge difference. And what we get, and again, this is probably the most common statement when someone starts microdosing for what we call treatment-resistant depression, meaning if your treatment's working, you don't show up with microdosing. But when it isn't working, or you can't stand the way it's working, what you say is, I'm back. I'm back. And the report is, I feel the way I used to feel before I was depressed. That's microdosing for depression, and it's an extraordinary breakthrough that will perhaps shift for the first time the worldwide depression cycle. Because the nice thing about microdosing, and I think you got the idea when I said it's a 10th to a 20th, it's not expensive. And it doesn't take a trained professional, and it doesn't take a clinic, and it doesn't take a hospital, and it doesn't take a social worker. There are microdosing coaches, and they're invaluable, but for most people, what we've looked at so far, and we're talking thousands, they say it helps. That's what we're looking at. And let's look at one other, which is a curious one, ADHD. ADHD is very peculiar in that a lot of people want the diagnosis, because if they get the diagnosis, they get to have stimulants. Remember, antidepressants are not stimulants. Stimulants are stimulants, like Adderall. So that we have a lot of false positives. We have people who have kind of figured out how to get hold of the drugs, and therefore are willing to accept the diagnosis. What we've found is that, and yes, and the drugs have side effects, and they have various things, but a lot of people say, look, I like the effects of the drugs. Yes, there are negatives, but it's worth it to me. And I don't feel like I feel without them. How early are people given these stimulant drugs? Remember, there's no cure, there's no improvement. It's simply covering the symptoms and making you feel better. At least in the United States, 3 years old, it's okay to drug someone for whatever their moods are, and understanding that they will not be off those drugs forever. Not a great system. Well, what we found is that the AADHP, a number of people basically say, I think the drugs aren't worth it or they're terrible for me. And microdosing seems to give me not the same amount of energy, not the same amount of clarity, but maybe 80% with no side effects. And if I want to stop, I stop. If I want to go on, I go on. So ADHD is a whole nother area. As you noticed in the opening, it's not discussed yet in Australia. It's not being researched, but it is, again, it's a growing condition, or it's a growingly diagnosed condition, or it's a sometimes made up condition. And the made up is real, and it's a little weird. I'll just give you one very brief story. Young psychiatrist, is hired by a prestigious university in their mental health department. And he's looking at the freshman medicals. And he realizes a number of these students that are listed as having ADHD don't seem to have any symptoms. And he said, I'm going to tell the parents the good news. And he starts to do that. And suddenly he's getting hate mail from the parents. And they're basically saying, don't you tell me that my child is well enough to not have the stimulant drugs that helped him get into your college. And I will have your job if you continue this behavior. I understand both sides of it, and fortunately, I'm not in that side of the game, but ADHD is a little mysterious in that way. And for people for whom it's not at all mysterious, it's a terribly debilitating syndrome. And many of the people on drugs like it, on the pharmaceuticals, and other people using microdosing have found similar benefits. Okay. Now, another major use is called tapering off your pharmaceuticals. It doesn't have a clinical name as far as I know, but there are a lot of pharmaceuticals that are very hard to get rid of, to get off, because you have terrible symptoms as soon as you come off them. Microdosing is used across the board for helping you slowly reduce a dose of a pharmaceutical. Okay. Now let's and let's also just look at, because I have a case that's so moving. The nice woman we just met, who had this great day at the office and enjoyed her food and was a better client. That's wonderful. Okay. There's another condition which is as widespread as depression. We have multiple causes, and it's almost as mysterious as depression. It's pain. It's the most common reason people go to a physician. Now, lots and lots of causes and so forth, but the brain and the body both produce pain. Okay. When you hurt yourself, that's because the nerves here have told your brain, somebody is just pinching the skin between my thumb and first finger. And I used to think, well, that was it. And if you had pain, if you did something, put anesthetic on it or whatever, it would go away. That's true of what we would call immediate pain. Why is there chronic pain? Why is there chronic pain for conditions for which the physical healing has been completed? Well, it turns out that there's another source of pain, which is called the amplifier effect, and it's from the brain, where the brain takes this little bit of pain and says, oh my God, that's important because your hand is in the burner on your stove. Let's add a little energy to that so you'll pull your hand away. So chronic pain is as if the signal to send pain noise to some parts of the body doesn't stop just because the part is healed. And a very strange kind of pain is called phantom limb pain, where you've had an arm amputated. So this doesn't exist, And yet sometimes it hurts. What's going on? Well, what's going on? Obviously, it isn't anything in the limb. It's gone. It's gone. There's nothing there. So your brain creates pain. Okay. What's the definition of pain? Again, what's the physical measurement of pain? There isn't any. Okay. Definition of pain is, does it hurt? Remember depression? Are you sad? Okay. Well, I'm going to tell you about a pain patient, and it's one of those things, if you have very small children, don't let them listen. This is a little gruesome. But I'm going to quote now from this woman. I have been in chronic disabling pain for over 20 years daily since I broke my back falling down a flight of stairs with my infant in my arms, landing on the center of my spine, cradling the baby. So she protected her baby in this serious fall. It was necessary to fuse parts of my back so I could function. I began to take pain medications, some of which had serious negative effects, but were necessary so I could raise my children. Okay, 20 years ago. October 22nd, 2022. Let's see if I have this right here. She used to wake up in pain, but immobile. And she would take several medications before she could move. After those medications, she could sit up and take some other medications, and eventually she could start her day. But almost anything would put her off, and she lacked energy. So literally, if someone was unkind to her early in the morning, she was done for the day. Okay, so she was on lots of pain meds, and I mean like 3 or 4, plus other medications, and barely functional. September 16th is when she started microdosing. October 23rd. Waking up is different now. There we go. Before microdosing, someone would have to rouse me from sleep, and I'd have to push through webs of myofascial nerve and muscle pain to even form words. I would take lethal doses of ibuprofen and opioid and depression and anxiety meds while lying flat. It would take 20 to 40 minutes after taking the meds before I could sit up without shearing pain, but still with substantial pain, let alone walk. With my first stand and step, my energy for the day would just begin to pour from my body. An interaction early, guaranteed exhaustion for the day. Weather would exacerbate it, rain, cold, seasonal changes. Today, October, it's cold, raining, cats and dogs, and the room I woke in is chilly. How does she feel today? I woke up on my own and without moving, looked around with my eyes, curious what the day would bring. I gently realized I felt no nerve, muscle, or myofascial pain. I felt like a child. It reminded me of that moment when I'd wake up before my mom and smile, knowing I would find something fun to do myself before anyone else walked. Microdosing has improved my sleep. My fibromyalgia, rheumatoid, and osteoarthritis pain have subsided to such a low level, I'm only vaguely aware they exist. My fingers were so swollen from arthritis, inflammation, and so disfigured, I could not move them freely. Now I can, and the swelling is down. My hand pain always woke me at night, as did my toe pain. No more. What's going on? That's what science is for. It's to take observations like that and say, what is this going on for this? Has made one change in her pain meds, and you got it. You got what happened. Now, I happen to have stayed in touch with her because it's so fascinating. And there's a whole series of her pain meds, 20 years of work, where she has dropped them. Some medicines are gone, some just a few. She has some additional chronic pain problems just due to the joints being replaced. That she says, I still have those pains, but they don't affect me the same way. They're simply pains in my joints. They're not my body is in pain. So that's pain. And that's amazing. So what I want to kind of make sure you get is that the range of improvements is quite extraordinary. And when we go to those are areas such as pain, ADHD, depression, we have a lot of experience. Okay, and experience meaning people from all over, from all walks of life, from all ages have checked in without knowing about each other, simply shared their stories to a common repository that we have that has led to this getting people interested in doing the research. And there's some wonderful research now going on in New Zealand. There's some other groups in the United States beginning to do research because of this overwhelming amount of personal data. So what other conditions have we looked at? Anorexia. I have a wonderful report which begins, I'm an anorexic and I have been microdosing for the last 3 months and have gained 30 pounds. Now, for an anorexic, that's like miracle talk. And she goes into great detail of her horrible anorexic decades and why microdosing worked for her. It didn't work like physiological magic. What she said is because I had so much therapy that I was never able to use. I knew things that would help me, but I was never able to use them. Microdosing gave me somehow the internal stability to start using what I'd learned. And her story is quite remarkable from there. Anxiety, anorexia, asthma, a whole host of conditions. And I mean a whole host. We're talking a large list, which includes some individual cases. This wonderful woman, I read about her pain. There are lots of other pain cases, but none as impressive and amazing and extraordinary as hers. We're very aware that a single case is science. And remember where we started saying self-observation is the only thing plus experiment that leads to scientific truth. Without self-observation, there's nothing to look at. How do you tell someone is not depressed? Well, since you couldn't measure they were depressed, you can't measure when they're not depressed. You use the same method. Are you not depressed now? Yes, I'm not depressed. Okay, that counts. Now, let's look at what a little science can do. Okay, woman I met over email and asked for some advice. I gave her some advice. She wrote back that it was great. Her depression was very alleviated. And then a couple of months later, she wrote me and she said, I got so excited when I wasn't depressed that I shared the idea of microdosing with a lot of my depressed friends. And they fell into two groups. Some of them have been microdosing for a few months and they said, I'm not depressed. I'm not microdosing anymore either. And another group said, I felt the same way. I just got much better. I didn't feel depressed. And I stopped microdosing. And a few weeks later, I was depressed again. And she said to me, what's the difference in those two groups? And part of me went, oh boy, is that the perfect study? Yum, yum, yum. I can hang out with my science friends and they won't be embarrassed to introduce me. And so I said to her exactly what you would say. Well, what do you think is the difference? Okay, what do I know? I don't know any of these people. And we talked for a little while. And finally she said, the people who stopped, their lives were pretty much working. The people whose depression returned, their lives weren't working very well. So one of the reasons you get depressed is things are hard, things are painful, things are depressing, things are sad, there's grief, there's reasons. Depression isn't something that floats out of the air. So what we're beginning to learn is not only what does it help, but how does it help and when do you stop and when do you continue and so forth. So we're into the next level of work. And at this point, rather than take you through a whole lot of other kinds of conditions, let's see if there are questions that have come up in the chat or questions that you have now that we can talk to in the time we have left. And we do have time set aside for your questions. So can I return us to our hosts and see what they have come up with?
Terrific. Thank you so much, Jim. I would like to invite anybody, if you do have questions, please do pop them in the chat, and we can take them from there. I have been having a read through as we've gone, Jim. The questions that have come through so far are all questions about different conditions and indications of exactly what you're speaking to.
Let's see what we can say about different conditions. And by the way, I don't know if can you all see what's in back of Ben? Ben has this, whatever he's got technically back there. He's like hanging out and the galaxies keep coming past and I keep enjoying it. So whatever you're doing, Bill, I hope that you that it's part of your life and your work as well as just for the pleasure of it. Or it's Ben, sorry, Ben, right. Okay. So okay, let's take a couple of conditions and see if see what I can say about them.
Great. Okay, perfect. So let's start with that. So first we had Alzheimer's.
Okay, what we're looking at with both dementia and Alzheimer's, by the way, Alzheimer's, there are at least 100 pharmaceuticals that have been tried for Alzheimer's, which means they're almost all going after the little packets of disturbed tissue in the brain. None of them have helped. Some of us have said, maybe you're looking at the wrong thing. Maybe it is that these packets are actually the brain's defense mechanism for what's going on. But in any case, we're not doing well with Alzheimer's. So what we know from microdosing, and we know from a couple, not of any studies, but what we do know is that individuals with dementia and with Alzheimer's, from time to time, when a family member has given them a microdose, a level of clarity and awareness and paying attention returns. Okay, so let me give you the example that comes to mind. This is the father of a rather famous jazz musician in the United States. The father has been taken care of by, I think, the sister, other members of the family, has not spoken in several months. Eats, sits, not unpleasant, but barely there. The son prepares a tape, audio tape or audio disc of jazz music that his father has liked in the past. And I'm just telling you the whole thing because I don't know what the variables are, and add microdosing. The father, after a while, starts to pay a little bit of attention. Yeah, he's kind of into it. And then he is humming along. And according to his son, he begins to sing lyrics. And what the son said, and some of the hard lyrics that have not, that he hasn't seen or heard in 30 years. That's the whole story. Okay. A different story. This is someone who was in a residential home or whatever we call those places for people who can't take care of themselves. And for the past month or so, he's basically had his head down, makes no contact, has one sentence like, what time is it? Or were you here yesterday? That kind of, and has stopped pretty much doing everything. He walks, but very slowly. He's visited by a couple of relatives, including a son-in-law, and we need this, is a professional juggler, okay? So they're sitting there and gives him a microdose, and gradually he becomes more alert. He interacts, he knows who he's talking to. At one point, he begins to tell them a story about a time when he was about 8 and he visited a zoo in Detroit, and he laughs. And the juggler says, here, I'm going to throw you a ball, and throws him a ball. Guy's sitting in a chair and he catches the ball. And the juggler says, throw it back. And he throws it back. And after a while, now remember, this isn't going to turn out to juggle. Oh, this isn't about juggling, but it is about playing ball with this guy who was maybe dementia, maybe just depressed, maybe Alzheimer, we don't know. But and I said, as you would expect, I said, well, what happens next? And they said, what happens next was COVID, and we were not allowed to visit anymore. So we have a couple of those stories in the Alzheimer's dementia range, and it's the area I think we're going to see the most intense research once people notice. Because again, we're talking about something that's safe. We're talking about something that seems to allow more cognitive flexibility, which we have from the well people and from the graduate students in math. So we have something that looks like it could not necessarily turn it around, but perhaps reduce the symptoms. So that's all we know. So that's Alzheimer's.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Jim. There have been a few other different questions, so I might pull some from other themes rather than just looking at different indications. There's a couple about schedules, doses and schedules.
Sure. Schedules. Okay. They're it's a little awkward, but the most used schedule around the world is called the Fadiman protocol. I didn't do it. I mean, I did make up the protocol, but I wasn't silly enough to name myself. It's taking it on day 1, not taking on day 2, not taking on day 3, taking it on day 4. So there's 1 day on, 2 days off. That's a lot of time without the medication. Psilocybin, by the way, leaves the body within about 6 to 8 hours. So, and what I had people do, the reason I had invented it is so people would come down to baseline and it'd go up again and then give me new information. So I'd get like 10 sets of information out of one person over a month. But it caught on as a possible protocol. It's now the most popular. And after about 10 cycles, people indicate that the second and third days seem quite similar. Also, almost all of the schedules show that during the off days, people often don't feel that much different. That's the Fadiman schedule. The other most famous protocol is the Stamets stack. And Paul Stamets, great mycologist, suggests taking psilocybin, lion's mane, which is a cognitive enhancing mushroom, and niacin, which opens up the arteries and basically allows the medication to go all over the body. His protocol was either 4 days on, 3 days off, or 5 days on, 2 days off. And so I said to Paul at one point, I said, which is it? And he looked at me, he said, you can't be too too rigid. And I thought, well, I could be too rigid. So we're just learning. There's also another very popular schedule called every other day. One of the advantages of every other day is you'll never make a mistake. With the Fadiman protocol, you have to be able to count to 3. Okay, with every other day, you only have to count to 1. So those are the 3 most important schedules worldwide that we know
of. Terrific. One other question related to that. Do you have any thoughts of the addition of lion's mane to micro?
There is some data. There was a little research study with, I think, 12,000 people, all microdosing and filling in all kinds of psychological tests and feeding the data into a group in Canada called Quantified Citizen. And it included the question is, are you taking the Stamets stack versus just plain psilocybin or other mixes? And the people taking the Stamets stack did better than people not taking the Stamets stack in a couple of the tests. One of them being a test of a kind of flexibility, which is called finger tapping over 10 seconds, and how many taps can you do? And it turns out for older people who microdosed on the Stamets stack, they were able to do more. It's not clear what to do with that data, but it suggests that there are differences, obviously, between psilocybin and other things. I know a number of other mixes, but those are the 2 best known and the only one that's had some, and the Stamets stack, the only one that's had some independent research.
Fantastic.
Now,
Thank
let
you.
me just throw in dose in case people are getting serious, which is the dose for psilocybin is approximately 1/10 of a gram, like that woman we first heard from, to 4/10 of a gram. That's for most people. There's a whole wonderful subset of people who took not 1/10 of a gram, but 1/100th of a gram, and they do fine. And they say if I take more than that, it's too much. So again, we're not talking. See, the problem is when you do clinical research, everybody's got to take the same amount for some reason. In reality, as you know, you vary your doses of everything. Imagine if ice cream could only be sold in like 4-ounce cubes. That's it. There's no other way. You say, wait a moment, that isn't the way I live. So what we found with microdosing is that's the dose range for most people is 1/10 of a gram to 4/10 of a gram. If you're talking about LSD, which is still quite popular, it's between, say, 7 and 12 micrograms. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. So that's doses, that's substances, that's schedules. That's pretty much what there is.
Scott, and I'm going to ask one more question, if I may.
Please.
Can you just give us an overview? Because it's important for our viewers to know that in Australia, whilst we are the first country in the world to legalize MDMA to treat PTSD and also psilocybin to be used to treat treatment-resistant depression as part of a clinical setting. What is the fundamental difference between a clinical dose and a microdose of these medicines?
Oh, well, one of the differences is, let us say that you happen to operate heavy machinery or that you teach medieval philosophy. If you take a clinical dose, you will not do those things. You will lie flat on your back with the headphones and eye shades, and you will have transformative, life-changing, amazing experiences. If you microdose, you will go to work and you will notice that you can operate the machine with less fatigue. When you're teaching medieval philosophy, you will be aware that, there's a connection between that medieval philosopher and that Iberian philosopher that I hadn't really seen before. So you're functioning better in your normal life. That's the major difference is microdosing is not about stopping. It's about your normal life. I think that's the major difference. And the clinical work is for clinical conditions and all of the training that is being done. The Australian training is very, very good. Okay. The fact that you're actually allowed to do it and the government is not against you makes it much easier. But also that's true in Holland and it's true in Jamaica and some other places. But the Australian training is very clear that you're dealing with a very extraordinary event in someone's mind, and they need to be safe, they need to be protected, they need to trust. All of the variables that go into that training are fundamental. This is a different world. If it wasn't if microdosing wasn't a psychedelic, you would never have invited me. Okay? But it happens to be. It doesn't have that's the other difference. Okay, major difference. No psychedelic effects, no visual distortions, no God speaking only to you. No anacondas eating you alive. That's popular in the ayahuasca world. No realizing that you are a divine individual and that you have lived for eternity and that you will never die. None of that.
Yeah.
Okay. Microdosing says, I really feel, better. I could talk to my boss more. And I got more out of my therapy because I talked. Okay. One of my friends who, when I was getting involved in this, she said, oh yeah, I've been doing it for 15 years. I said, what's the major, do people notice when you're microdosing? She said, well, I turned down the light level on my computer, but I don't think anything else that anyone would notice. So does that answer partly your question?
Yeah, fantastic. And I'm going to surmise here that over a prolonged period of time.
Okay.
And then I'm going to surmise here that over a prolonged period of time, a person can microdose and also anecdotally treat the same conditions that could be treated under a clinical setting.
Well, one of the questions for any condition is, does it, and I think the term remission rate, is,
Yeah.
do people stay recovered? And we know not too much about that in, not only not in psychedelics, but
Yes.
we don't know that in pharmaceuticals. You are given a pharmaceutical and you are told for your depression is you are to use it for the next 42 years with your lifespan. And you say to the guy, well, what's the research on people using it over 10 or 20 years? He said, we don't have any, because we, the manufacturer and the discoverer, find there's no economic benefit for us knowing how long it'll last and how long you have to take it and what are the side effects after many years. There is 2 studies put out by the US government where they actually measured people who took antidepressants for 20, 30 years and a similar matched group, I don't know how they found them, who didn't. Mental health in the non-medical group was better. That's why psychedelics are so valuable, because we're really, the bar to improve mental health or over pharmaceuticals is quite low. And psychedelics, when they are done effectively, are life-changing in ways that simply the rest of psychopharmacology doesn't touch. It's kind of like, you can climb mountains in Australia, and it doesn't prepare you to climb Everest. Nothing wrong with the mountains in Australia. They just have a different nature and a different scale.
Yeah.
So, and see, I remember I've been in psychedelic research, high dose, for most of my career. I thought all this low dose stuff was just trivia because it didn't take you to life-changing events. What I'm finding is that my daily life is trivia, and I prefer it healthier, and most people do, so that if they then wish to take high doses therapeutically or any other way, they're much better prepared.
And that actually answers one of the final questions, was, does microdosing induce a does it induce a
neuroplasticity, which is the ability to form new connections. The work on individual neurons, not inside people, but inside little laboratory dishes. Microdosing increases the number of dendrites, the number of spokes, the number of connecting tissues that makes for better neurons. And one of the reasons that it can do that versus high doses, which increase the connections but not necessarily maintain them, is every several days you're basically feeding the neuron. So we have a very different, it's obviously if you take something once or you take it 50 times, that's different physiologically, no matter how good once is. 50 is different, maybe not as good. So that's the term neuroplasticity, which it just sounds like some terrible disease you don't want to have, but what it really means is your capacity of the brain to be more flexible. And that is the capacity which, when we're children and we look at adults, we think, my God, they're solidified. They have no flexibility. I say to my friend, I'm a mouse, and my friend says, squeak, squeak, and chases me. If you do that with tween adults, they don't get it. They say, no, that's childish behavior, or you're crazy. So we're really talking very different effects, not different in sort, neuroplasticity, but we're talking very different effects in terms of long-term solidified, physiologically based changes.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Keep in mind that I've been in that other world. I listen to me and I think, whoa, he's a zealot, isn't he? He just thinks microdosing will do everything but fry eggs. And that only comes, that kind of zealotry or kind of is, I've been reading reports like the ones I gave you for 12 years from all over the world, and I do get very excited. I'm amazed. I mean, that anorexic that started with that moment, I wrote her immediately and got all kinds of interesting things. So people write me and I'm exploring. And so remember when you were at camp and you sat around a fire and people told stories, that's what microdosing research is. It's going back to the original science of self-observation, observation of other people's self-observation, and then saying to the current scientific community, isn't that interesting? Now, I have a friend in Canada who's involved in palliative care. Palliative care is when you're dying. And he's using microdosing. And I said, what are you doing for it? He says, no, everybody dies. That's not the question. When people are dying, they get drugged to reduce pain, to reduce suffering, to reduce spasms, symptoms. They're also not able to function very well. You know, I visited my father and I don't know if he knew I was there or not. What he's finding is his patients who are microdosing have a ability to communicate with their beloveds, and their beloveds feel communicated with. And so the quality of the end of life has improved. Palliative care with high doses is a totally different matter. But what we're seeing is here's a place where microdosing simply allows functioning that can cut through the opiates. And that's pretty, you know, that's another one we're looking at. And the fact that he happens to be very well placed in Canada in the palliative medical world is going to make that a very important study.
Thank you so much, James. Scott, any final remarks?
So,
no, I think, but
I think I said to you guys a little bit that I was going to use the book that we're writing as a basis for this talk. And so this is the first time I've done it. And I am very grateful to you all. As much as I could tell, I didn't see people going from face to black to off. So I think we're okay. And this is what we're talking about. And the reason that we had to write a book about it is because there were too many stories about too many conditions that we want people to get interested in. Okay. So when someone writes me and said, my father-in-law has Parkinson's, I have something to say that might be helpful. Not that we're going to change Parkinson's, but we may be able to change the quality of life. And with some people, like many conditions, like this pain person, the change is much more remarkable. So I'm very grateful that you all came. I'm very grateful that I got to share with you for the first time a lot of this material. So that's really, you know, thanks, mates.
Appreciate it. And for those of you who want to hear Jim more, please join our CPAP program next year, starting February. And I'll put a link in the chat for those of you who want to sign up. And then we'll also put a link to Jim's new book in the thank you note that we'll send out later today. Sorry, Scott, over to you.
Okay.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, Jim. It's an absolute pleasure, as always, to have you. We're incredibly lucky to have you sharing your wisdom with us. So,
well, you always bring in so many nice people. What can I do? Okay. Good night, you all. I mean, it's night for me, so good afternoon to you.
Good evening, Jim, and goodbye, everybody. For anybody who did want to join us for CPAT next year, the applications are open until the end of November. So we would love to see some of you, and you have an opportunity to learn even more deeply from Jim, as well as the rest of our amazing faculty. So thank you all so much. We'll see you next month, where we're back with Professor Robin Carhart-Harris.